tonight is week 6 of our Ordinary People series, and I think there's about 2 weeks left, but we'll kind of play it by ear and see how things go. So week 6 of our Ordinary series, and tonight we're looking at Joshua. I don't know how much you know about Joshua. He's an Old Testament character, and he is actually the person who is put in charge of leading the entire people of Israel right after Moses passes away. And most of us, if not all of us, know who Moses is, right? Like, he's this huge biblical character, and he's like responsible for so many different things that we're going to find out a little bit of him today, but he's this really big deal. And so if you think about Joshua, like, he has some really big shoes to fill. Like, if he's going to be the one that's going to follow after Moses, then he's got a lot on his plate, like huge shoes to fill. Think about if you have like a class presentation. Everybody has been working on a different project for your class, and now you each have to present it one by one, right? Like, imagine going after the smartest person in your class. Once they get done, you're like, oh my gosh, how am I supposed to follow that? That was amazing. My theory, my trick was always to go first. Like, I felt like if I could present first, then I'm setting the bar. I don't have any expectations, any shoes to fill. So that was always my strategy when it came to presenting in class. But when you look at Joshua, he obviously couldn't do that. Like, he was there to take charge, take lead of Israel once Moses died. So Joshua probably felt like you feel when you have to go and present after the smartest person in your class. And so when we look at the book of Joshua, there's an entire book. It's called Joshua. It's 21 chapters long. So we're gonna skim and learn from the overarching story of Joshua itself. And the book of Joshua picks up in the history of the people of Israel when Joshua takes lead. So the book of Joshua isn't Joshua's entire life. It is just when he takes lead of Israel. But we actually get little bits and pieces of Joshua's life from the previous books in the Bible: Exodus, Deuteronomy, and Numbers. And some of the things that we see about Joshua's life during them is that, like, at a young age, the Bible says when he was in his youth, Joshua was chosen by Moses to be his assistant. So Moses, this really huge biblical character, chooses Joshua from a young age to be his assistant. So that's a crazy story to think about. Like, when they say youth or young age, we're looking at like middle school, high school. So when he was maybe your age, he was chosen by Moses to be his assistant. And then later on, we see that Joshua gets to go up the mountain with Moses when Moses receives the 10 Commandments, right? Like, Moses meets face to face with God. He's one of the only people who had ever done that in the Bible, and he meets face to face with God, and God gives him the 10 Commandments. And Joshua wasn't necessarily right there when it happened, but the Bible does say that he went up the mountain with Moses. So the entire people of Israel are down, not on the mountain, and Joshua gets to go up the mountain with Moses when Moses meets God face to face. So that's another crazy story from Joshua's life that we see in some of the books before the book of Joshua. And as we see later, once we get into the book of Joshua, he is the one that is going to lead the people of Israel into the promised land. So we get some context of Joshua's life, but what we also need to know in order to understand how God uses Joshua is we need to know like what is going on with the people of Israel right now. So some more context for you. Before Joshua was appointed as the leader of Israel, he was Moses' assistant, as we learned. And he was Moses' assistant from his youth all the way until Moses died. And Moses was the guy that God chose, right? Like most of you know who Moses was. He freed the people from slavery. They were slaves in Egypt for over 400 years. And God chose Moses to lead the people of Israel out of Egypt. Remember, if you remember, they crossed the Red Sea. Remember, Moses parts the Red Sea, the people of Israel cross through it, and then God closes the water in on the Egyptians as they're chasing the people of Israel. And then once they get beyond the Red Sea, they head out into the wilderness. And when they're in the wilderness, the people of Israel like panic. They're like, oh my gosh, we have no food, no water. We were in slavery, but we were kind of comfortable. We had food and water and a place to sleep. Now we're out here in the wilderness, and they begin complaining and they turn away from God. And it's because the people of Israel complained, and it's because they turned away from God in the wilderness that God decided, and he told Moses this, and he decided that generation, the generation that was living in the wilderness, was not worthy of moving into the land that God had promised. Because before Moses even led the people out of Egypt, God had promised the people of Israel a land that was flowing with milk and honey. That's what the Bible says. It basically means that it was a really great place to live. It had fertile soil. It was great to raise cattle, and there was flowers and food there, and it was going to be a fantastic place to live. And when the people of Israel got to the wilderness, they turned away from God, so God was like, your generation is not worthy of the land that I have promised you. And so what we see then, this is still the context, hang in there with me. What we see then is that Moses is the last person alive from that generation. So when Moses dies, it's then that the people of Israel can now move into the promised land. So to tie those two sets of context stories together, when Moses dies, Joshua takes charge. And when Moses dies, the people of Israel can now move into the promised land, meaning that Joshua is the one who is to lead the people of Israel into the promised land. So now that we got that context, we can pick up right where the book of Joshua starts. In Joshua's rise to leadership, Moses passes away, and he's gonna do it. He's gonna lead the people of Israel into the promised land. The thing is, the story isn't that simple, right? The promised land is like this massive expanse of land, but there's already a ton of different cities and towns within that land. So there's already people living there. So even though God promised this land to them and they're about to take it, it's not that easy. They have to fight the people who are already living there to conquer the land and actually move in. And this is kind of where we see God start to work in the book of Joshua. See, on their journey, the first obstacle they reach, the people of Israel and Joshua hit the Jordan River. Now, I don't know much about the actual size of the Jordan River, but it says in the Bible that it was a huge river that they weren't going to be able to just walk across. It was a strong river. God steps in here for the first time in the book of Joshua and stops the Jordan River so that the people of Israel can now head to the land that God himself had promised to them. So right off the bat, we see God working through Joshua to stop the Jordan River so that the people can move into the promised land. And then once they get to the other side of the Jordan River, it's go time, right? Like it's time to conquer these different towns, which means that there's battles to be had. And I'm guessing none of you have been in war, maybe like a war or a fight with a sibling or a friend or something, but nothing like conquering a town. And what you can't imagine about those people is that they were afraid. And if you've ever heard the phrase, it's painted on people's walls all the time, or like it's used as wall decoration. It says, be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. If you've ever heard that saying before or seen it on somebody's living room wall or something, that's where this verse comes from. This verse comes from the book of Joshua, when God speaks to Joshua as they begin their journey into the promised land. And I'm sure that the people of Israel were terrified to go into this battle. And so this is where God steps in and he says, listen, war is scary, but don't be afraid. Be strong and courageous. Don't be afraid, for I am with you wherever you go. And as we look at the entirety of Joshua's story, that is like one of the major keys right there. If you're taking notes, that's the verse that you're going to want to write down. And that's why it is so popular, because it's powerful. That is something that you and I, we can both hold on to. It's something that we can apply to our lives probably daily. Maybe weekly for some of you, or maybe monthly, depending on your lifestyle. But there are always things in this world that we are afraid of, and the Lord promises that he will be with us wherever we go, and that because of that, we can be strong and courageous. See, what we see from this is that in all that Joshua has to face, right? Whether it was in his youth or in his leadership of Israel into the promised land, it's the faith in God. It's his faith that God is always with him that makes his life extraordinary, right? Like, Joshua's life really, truly is extraordinary from very early on. He's chosen to be Moses' assistant at a really young age. Like, that's extraordinary. But what I want to tell you guys here tonight is that it's not Joshua's life experience that makes him extraordinary. It's not you or I's life experience that makes us extraordinary. No, it is our faith in God that makes us extraordinary. It's what God does through us, through you and I, through Joshua, that makes us extraordinary. To have so for Joshua to have faith in God from a young age is the same as like for you and I chasing what we feel God is leading us into, right? Like our faith often causes us to make decisions that we might be afraid of, or that might not necessarily seem like they're logical. They might seem like they're not logical, like they're like silly or ridiculous ideas, but when we feel God urging us to them, just because we don't know what is going to happen from that decision doesn't mean that God isn't with us and that we can be strong and courageous. And so when we look at the rest of the book of Joshua, we see Joshua and the people of Israel, they go on to conquer all the land, and they divide it up amongst the tribes of Israel just as God had promised. And then we see that Joshua lives to be 110 years old. That's pretty old. I hope to maybe live that old. But before Joshua dies, he gives the people of Israel one last charge. And he says this: "You have now seen all that the Lord promised come true." He's saying, in your generation, in your lifetime, God promised that you would move into the promised land, right? The land of milk and honey. He says, now you've seen that come true. We conquered all the towns and cities. We moved in. Everybody's land was divided, so everybody had a place to live. And you witnessed it all happen by the power of God. He says, you have seen how God gave all the people that lived in the land into our hands. He says, you've seen how God helped us conquer and defeat all the people that lived here before. Joshua says, God has fulfilled all that he had promised, and we now eat the fruit of which we did not plant. And then he says, because of this, because you have seen all these things happen, you must choose whom you will serve. And then he says this: as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And that's another one of those lines that you might see up on someone's wall in their house, right? As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. That's where this comes from too. And this is Joshua's final charge to the people of Israel. He says, after you've seen all that God has done, after God has fulfilled all the promises that he said he would in your life, it's now your turn to choose. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And so, that is the charge that Joshua gave to the people of Israel, and that's the same charge I give you guys today. See, it's through God that our lives shift from ordinary to extraordinary. Joshua lived an extraordinary life from a very early age because he had faith in God from a very early age. When we looked at Peter, right? Like, God shifted Peter's life from ordinary to extraordinary, but Peter was an ordinary person for a long period of his life until he met God. When we look at Joshua, we might see an extraordinary person, not an ordinary person. But what we've come to understand, that ordinary people aren't ordinary because of their life experiences, but because of their faith. So if you choose God in your life, if you choose Jesus in your life, that's the moment when your life shifts from ordinary to extraordinary. So, as for me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord.